Hey folks, my name's Kevin and it's time for a little bit more knife nerdery. And today we've got the full small details review of the Brian Brown Knives Raptor. This is a production knife OEM'd by Reate, and this particular one was sent to me by Brian Brown himself. And that is honestly a very surreal sentence to be able to say out loud, especially for a channel my size and the fact that I didn't have some kind of like rapport and friends with him ahead of time. He offered to send me these, and that's just incredibly generous. He also sent me this Yeager-M to check out, this incredibly beautiful one that's been modified by Fanatic Edge. And I can't get over the generosity and the kindness. Thank you so much. I did get in on the pre-order of this next Yeager-M, but I didn't get in on the pre-order on these Raptors. And so this is my chance to check them out. So who is Brian Brown? Brian Brown is a custom knife maker from Mississippi. He's got a delightful southern drawl, and he started making knives, I think 6, maybe 7 years ago. He taught himself entirely at home just by watching YouTube videos and working in his machine shop, and all of his custom knives are made entirely by hand. The perimeter of them is water jet out to save time, but everything else is done by hand. There's no CNC work involved. And he started off, I believe, with fixed blades and then worked his way into folding knives the way a lot of knife makers do. And he, at some point, decided to do a production run of one of his earlier designs, the Yeager, as the Yeager-M. The first batch was done with Wii, and then he moved to Reate for the second one, not because there was anything wrong with the Wii ones, because he wanted to be able to do more custom different versions. He said that Wii didn't want to do as many variants at the batch size he was working with, and that's the main reason. But man, the results on these is so freaking good. But when he decided to make this didn't start as a custom knife. You can definitely see the design influence here, expanding from something like his old Warthog design, this kind of jimped thumb ramp here, this extra swell with another notch right there, and this top swedge. This is definitely something that came through on those. But this one, when he started drawing it out and he made a single prototype by hand, he said, no, that is a little bit too similar to some things I've made before, and thus it'd make a perfect addition as a production knife. So this one has been a production knife from the get-go. When I first saw this, I didn't get in on this deliberately. Like, I didn't miss out. I chose not to buy this knife. And the reason was entirely just an aesthetics thing for me and a little bit on the size. So I don't personally tend to go for clip point blades, and I don't personally tend to go for knives that are 3.5 inches. And that's what this one's labeled as. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment, but the result is I intentionally just kind of skipped on this knife. And as soon as people got them in hands, everyone I knew that had one told me that I was a fool for doing that these are spectacular. Now that I actually have one in hand, yeah, these are incredibly well made and incredibly well thought out. I'll talk about my final thoughts on whether or not I regret it truly in the end, but for now, wow, these things are very, very cool. So let's get into this blade. I said that one of the reasons why I didn't pick this up originally is because this is labeled as a 3.5 inch blade. And I totally get how he's doing that. I talked to Brian about how he's measuring that, and he said that he's measuring this entire total blade length, which means he's measuring from this tip down to this extended. And I don't mean like at a diagonal, but this dimension. And I don't normally measure there. If you're talking from like a legality perspective, all bets are off. Cops can measure however the heck they want. And so, if you're worried about it from a legal perspective, it's always better to round up a little bit. But this knife, I typically measure from the front of the handle. And in that case, this is going to be a 3 3/8 inch blade, which again, that's pretty close, 3.37, something like that. But the reality of that is that it's a little bit smaller than I was anticipating. That's partly why I found that this actually worked better for me than I was expecting. Now, this is reasonably thick blade stock on like an EDC knife by my standards, not by a lot of people's standards, but I tend to like really, really thin and light knives. And so this is a what is this, 0.154, it's like 3.92 millimeter blade stock. And so that's a little bit on the hefty side for me, but oh my God, the way that they get away with it is by having this incredible hollow grind. One of the things that Reate does really, really well is not just thin hollow grinds, but look at that belt satin in there. Oof. This blade has a particularly interesting design in the way it's working this swedge stuff at the top, because it has this second bump at the top here, notch right there, and then it trails down again, and it has this very pronounced swedge. Now you can see that this swedge, that like the full flat, get that to focus, the full flat of the knife comes out all the way to there. This is the flats, this is the full blade stock, and this swedge up here is thinning it out. And the higher you get up on this little bump up here, the more thin it's going to be. So it's thinner right there than it is at the bottom. That's important because this is where you're going to be putting your finger or your thumb, either in this kind of grip or in that kind of grip. And what that means, the fact that it's thicker down here and at the top, and this little swell right here, means that this is actually incredibly comfortable to put a lot of force against. It's still quite thick right there, and as a result, yeah, that just feels great. But then you can see that that swedge ends right here, which means that this is basically the full thickness again. This is that grind line. And so this is basically the full thickness of the blade again. And because this then clipping point drops down below this line only a little bit, it's not going to thin out tremendously thin by the end, but it is a hollow grind, and hollow grinds drop off fast, and that's how you get this tip. So this is a really robust tip, and it means that even though this knife has a hollow grind, this tip is actually something that you don't have to worry at all about snapping off or anything like that. You could do some really serious work up here at the tip. The other side effect of that is that if you choke up in this kind of thing, where you have your finger up here and you're putting your finger on that part down there, you can put your finger on a really nice landing zone. Your index finger can press right there, and you can get a lot of force behind something. So this design is really pretty interesting. It does also mean that the blade edge itself, can I get that to focus, is going to get larger. The cutting grind is going to get larger at the top, and that's a matter of just this getting thicker and thicker and thicker. The grind itself is actually interesting to talk about because when you look at the knife, people typically hold it like this, and this line are parallel, and so this can actually set down on a table and not have the blade touch. And if you look at from that perspective, it looks kind of like this is a normal flat surface here, and it works that way in terms of cutting on if you want it to be a flat. But if you look at the grind itself, the grind is actually angled upwards. And so if we have this is going to represent the grind for us. The knife you normally hold like this, but the grind isn't flat like that. The grind comes up, and what that means is that if you angle this instead along the grinds axis, this actually comes down further before going back up. What that means is that this part here is taller than it is over here. So this is actually the thinnest part of the blade. So this is not a knife that gets insanely thin behind the edge, but it gets pretty good. This one is different at each different point. So up here, it's about 22 thousandths. And down here, where this hollow grind has even a longer distance to thin out, this is about 19 thousandths. And then of course, if you come back up to the top up here, you're basically coming up to the top, not quite, but basically to the top of that hollow grind. And so back up here, right behind this edge, is about 45 thousandths, and then hence that kind of big, thick spot. Now, at the very back end of this, we talk about where we get our sharpening choil and our plunge grind. The plunge grind is the grind that takes it from the full thickness up here down to the thinness down here. And this is one of the few spots that they don't do. I mean, I've seen Reate do better on some other knives. Can I get this in a different lighting? There we go. That may show it better. It's not bad by any means, but you can see that the plunge grind ends right about there, like right about at the edge of this. Yeah, right about there. So it's not bad, but it's it could be a little bit better in terms of a sharpening choil. You're not going to get a ton of sharpens out of this, and you can see actually the way it's done right now. There's a very little bit of a lip right there already. Actually, I don't know if this has ever been sharpened by Brian. This is apparently his personal knife. I don't know. It didn't come in brand new packaging, so maybe it's even a little bit different. Maybe it's been sharpened by him. I don't know. The way this is done, though, means that this works incredibly well as a spot to choke up. It's basically like a flat-ish finger choil. And we'll talk about this more when we talk about ergonomics, but this kind of grip, being able to hold it right here, feels so incredibly good. And because they've ground this at an angle like this, it doesn't come straight down, means that I can press my finger right up against it and I don't feel like I'm going to cut myself. Sure, if I slid forward, I would, but this is not one of those ones that's constantly jabbing you and doing a little puncture wound at the end. Up here we have jimping on this like very kind of subtle thumb ramp, and that the combination of this slight upswept and this jimping right here means this locks you in super, super well. This is not my absolute favorite kind of jimping because I tend to like it a little bit closer together, but this is actually really, really, really good jimping. And what makes it that way is that it's reasonably shallow and reasonably sharp. And what that means is that you can press down on this and it's not going to feel like it's hurting you pushing in, because the shallowness means that your thumb can't really push in deep into those little hooks, but that crisp edge there makes this super duper duper lock in. And the fact that it's a little bit more spaced out means that this will lock you in even if you're wearing something like gloves. And wow, it really does feel locked in. Like I said earlier, this part here works both for your forefinger and for your thumb, especially if you're choked up like this. This works really, really well as placement. And this extra bump here acts as an additional thumb ramp or finger ramp, you know. And so you can push in several different grips, quite a lot of force, and not feel like you're going to slip anywhere. So this, as much as I don't aesthetically love these kind of extra hooks and these kind of swoops on the back of a blade, functionally, they work tremendously well. Moving back some to talk about this handle, wow. Okay, so I've heard some people describe this knife as looking imbalanced. It's one of those knives that has a thicker blade than it does handle, by a lot actually. That's definitely going to be an aesthetic thing. But what this does mean is that it works interestingly in a lot of different grips. I was kind of nervous at first. This is one of the things that made me think that maybe this knife wouldn't feel great in hand, because I'm sometimes hesitant of knives that have a very thick spot here and a very thin spot here, because that transition can sometimes leave this part of your hand feeling hollow. But oh my God, this thing feels surprisingly fantastic in hand. It's very thin right here. And on some knives, like if it stayed that way the entire way, that this could feel like it's going to twist in your hand. But what I've found is the fact that this swells back out to the end and has this thicker part at the back here means that your fingers back here are able to hold it in a way that this doesn't feel like it's going to twist in my hand at all. I was really surprised to see that. And especially if you choke up and use this part up here, this is so tall that again, yeah, even in like a hammer grip, yeah, this is not going anywhere. I've also really been surprised at how comfortable this is. Like having my finger up here and having these back. Like I said, sometimes this leaves you feeling like you have somewhere you want to be, like it's not full enough in there. And I don't have that whatsoever here. It does feel thin. It doesn't feel like it's filling out your hand the way some do. But seriously, this is surprisingly ergonomic. Where I think this actually really, really shines though is in a pinch grip. We've got this backspacer back here that protrudes just slightly, and aesthetically it just looks really cool. But these little jimping marks, which echo the jimping there in style and shape and sizing and everything, actually do provide traction just a little bit right at the back of your hand. And this curve back here means this sits in your hand in this really, really nice way. That jimping just gives you a little bit of traction. This swoop here gives you the perfect part to wrap your fingers against and press in, and this is where you get to then rest your finger on that. And one thing also is this pivot is slightly concave, and it has this nice rounded pivot collar on the outside. And as a result, you push your finger down on that, and holy crap, that feels so good. It's such a delightful little spot to put your thumb on, and it's just such a good like kind of, like positioning, like a locating spot. I instantly know exactly where my hand is. And this thin handle here ends up giving this kind of almost like a pen knife or like X-Acto knife feel to it. I wasn't expecting it, but this ends up feeling like you can do some really precise work. You really have a lot of control. And that's another thing. I don't normally expect knives that are approximating 3.5 inches to make me feel like I have a lot of control and visibility over the tip. That's usually a little bit far away from my particular hand size. But again, the way that this all kind of fits here, I feel like I know exactly where it is. Part of that has to do with the balance on this knife. You'd think that a knife like this could be unbalanced because of just the sizing difference, but this is such a thin hollow grind that it cuts a lot of the weight out of this blade. Then there's really, really heavy pocketing on both sides of here, like incredibly milled out. And as a result, the balance point on this knife is right about here. And that's like effectively perfect, because when you're holding a knife in your hand, you want the balance point to be exactly where your index finger is, and then you want the weight of the handle to be distributed evenly throughout your hand, and then you want what you'll get there is a knife that feels nimble in your hand. If the blade is too heavy, it's going to feel like it's swinging around and you're kind of chasing that. If the handle's too heavy, then you won't have a great sense of the blade as it moves. But this knife is like kind of absolutely perfectly balanced. And that's part of why this feels so, in control and precise. Talking more about these handles though, wow, look at the milling on this. Actually, let's talk about the finishing on this in general. Even getting back up to the blade, like look for a moment right here. You can see, get the light to catch it there. We have this really delightful bevel that goes along this entire way and goes along this entire way here. And if you look along the edge of the handle here, it's glowing right now. There's this little bevel running, come on, focus, this little bevel running along the entire inside there and running along this entire inside here. It's just so cleanly done. Every surface feels so good. And one thing that this knife does that a lot of knives fail to do is mix little crisp lines like those bevels with this kind of grounded contouring. Let me close this real quick. Yeah, this is delightfully contoured. It has these really smooth round transitions on the end. Like this is so smooth, and it gives you this almost kind of melted feel. But most of the times when a knife has an almost kind of melted feel, it usually is because of a general imprecision everywhere. Like it really does feel like it's kind of melted, and melting never happens precisely. This manages to combine those two things. This has this kind of perfect rolling off smoothness, but then it ends exactly in this same perfect crisp line. That's the exact same amount the entire way. There's no unevenness on how this curve happens. This is, I think, a really good example of Reate just being a spectacular production company. Every little bit of finishing on this knife, from these hand satin flats, that grind lines there, the smoothness. Yeah, seriously, this is really, really well built. In terms of unlocking this lock bar, there's no recession on this side whatsoever. Sometimes the handles will be cut back here to give you more access, but instead what you have is two really large scallops. And it's I find it, at least with my size thumbs, super duper easy to get in here. And this is a reasonably strong lock bar. And so that's sometimes a worry for me. But this is a wide enough blade stock that you get a pretty good gap right here. And yeah, that is super duper easy to close. Now, let's talk about that closing for a moment, because I'm skipping. Normally I talk about the opening action first, but okay. Actually, let's talk about that opening. This is a thumb stud only knife, and it is tremendously easy to open, both as a thumb flick and a middle finger flick. Now, I did find that I had like flawless, really, really satisfying thwack open 90% of the time. And about 10% of the time, I pushed and felt like I was pushing up against a wall. And what's going on there is that this is in far enough. And the way that this handle curves down, it meant that I was holding this in my hand more canted this way than I was expecting. And so what I found is that I was pushing not up and not out, but because of the weird way I was holding it in my hand, I was pushing too much into the pivot. The other thing that was happening is I was pressing slightly on this lock bar, and this is not one of those knives that completely locks up when the lock bar goes on. It's definitely affected by lock bar pressure, but you can still push it out. But I figure if I take my hand entirely off that lock bar, yeah, it's definitely easier. Now that in and of itself is a little bit of a problem, because this is a thin handle like we talked about, and an entire half of it is that lock bar. So it's pretty hard to get your fingers off this lock bar. The good news is I don't find it to be truly problematic, but someone like left-handed, someone like lefty EDC, he might have trouble with this. I'd have to ask him if he actually did have trouble, because yeah, it's really hard to find somewhere to put your thumb that's not right on there. And when I'm opening with a thumb stud, again, I tend to kind of hold it like this, keep my finger down. If I were pinching it up here, it might be hard, but it's really easy to do. These thumb studs themselves are really, really great. There's this extra interesting little ring at the bottom that's milled in that I think is just stylistic, but then you have these steps right here, and it gives you such good traction. I have never found myself even remotely sliding off of this. In fact, this is like one of the most like locked in I've ever felt on a thumb stud. And so especially if you go either up or just like slightly out, ooh, that is so good. But check this out. I already showed that once, but I just want to show it again. Oh, wow, that's good. This is exceptional closing action. It kind of swung down there and kind of hovered just a moment at the end, and that's because my finger is slightly on the lock bar, adding more pressure. It's incredible how good this is, and part of that is because of how this is a reasonably strong lock bar. Like, I was expecting this to not fall all the way down, but it really, really does. And a large part of that is this blade being long enough, and the way that this thickens back out here means that we're not, a lot of knives get thinner and thinner and thinner, and the center of gravity of the blade is further back. By having this Swedge end and have this tip thicken back out, we're pushing that center of gravity back out. And since this is long enough, gravity has a lot of ability to just kind of pull this blade down. When Brian sent this to me, this pivot was cranked really pretty tight down. So in order to get it drop like this, literally all I've done is backed this pivot out about a 1/16 of a turn, not a quarter, nothing, like a 1/16. That's barely anything. And with that, this is still absolutely dead centered and absolutely bank fault. This is not even the slightest bit of wiggle. And often on on long knives, you can kind of warp the blade a little bit to kind of give yourself the impression of wiggle, but this is thick enough that, yeah, you can't. This feels so incredibly locked in. That is the other side of Reate construction. Reate knives tend to feel tanky in this just really delightful way. Like they can make thin, light knives that don't feel tanky too, but when they make knives that especially if they have thicker blade stock like this, and especially on frame locks, they tend to snap into place in this just really delightful, ooh, yeah, it feels so secure. As far as that closing goes, this is one of the things that I was kind of surprised by. The angle of the detent. So this is how early is the detent. This is how far you have to close the knife while you're up on the lock bar before you hit this detent ball. It's a little bit further down than I was expecting. And I say further down than I was expecting because over here on the Yeager, which came out first, this is 10 degrees, almost exactly. And there is a detent ball ramp. It's not a perfect detent ball ramp because you do have to bump up at the beginning, but it's a detent ball ramp. And so this one's a little bit easier to close. It falls a little bit, you don't have to close it as far until you're up on that. And then there's a detent rail ball to push, to detent ramp to push past. This one is almost twice. Yeah, I measured this at almost exactly 20 degrees. Oh, by the way, I had a couple of people ask me how I measure that. And I have basically two methods that I measure. If there's a really clean flat back like this that I can really easily put it on, I will sometimes use my angle cube. I'll just zero it out. I'll put this down at the point like there. I'll hook it on the back. I'll clip it on like that. I'll zero it out and then I'll open it back up and see what it says. On a knife like this that doesn't have a clean spot for me to attach that to, because this attaches via magnets on the bottom, I will actually use, what are these? A protractor, and measure it. And I will put this basically at that spot. I'll line this up with, how do I do this? I'll line this hole here up with the center of that. I'll make sure that that line is up there with that, and then I'll open this up and see where it lands. On this one, if I do it correctly, and I'm actually paying attention to all that, it lands right almost exactly at 20 degrees. And the thing is first of all, that's not bad. 20 degrees is absolutely average for a knife. This one over here is just doing it kind of exceptionally, but I'll tell you why it doesn't matter on this. The first is that it's just so easy to get your thumb in here to press this over that it's not hard to close this to the point where it's on the lock bar. And there's no flipper tab here to get in your way. The point where this really, really matters on knives is if there's a big flipper tab here that's going to be smashing into your thumb. And this has this delightful spot right here to make this flat to press against. But if you're pushing your thumb into where this notch actually is, then that goes right past you. And on some knives, especially ones that are wanting to free fall, a knife going right past you like that and nothing to fall on your thumb can be dangerous. But this part being thick like it is means that this free falls right like that. Your thumb is always hitting this flat spot and this blade is coming nowhere close to you. I guess if you really tried to, you could push in on this with your knuckle sticking up and maybe you could contact, but I find that this is tremendously easy to close in a way that makes it fall to my thumb without any risk whatsoever. And it's hard for me to do this under a camera. My camera's right down, which means if I do this, you're not really going to be able to see what I'm doing. But then once you take your thumb out, yeah, it just falls straight down. I particularly like seeing it fall like that, so I like putting it up directly just at the top and then just seeing it go whoop. Okay. Yeah, the action on this is really, wow, the snap is just so good. What else do I want to talk about this? Oh, the clip. Okay, so the clip is kind of an evolution of the clip he has over here. You can see on both of these, he has this kind of swooping out clip, and it's the same kind of stuff he does on his customs. But one thing that I really like is that he's changed the direction of these to kind of coincide with how curvy the knife is. This one is a straight kind of backed knife, and so it goes straight along. And this one is a curved up knife, and so he curved it along. And that just fits the styling really nicely. But one of the things that he did change on this that I like better, that makes this clip a little bit more functional for me, very, very minor here, but if you look at the back, this comes in with a pretty shallow point right here of contact. So all of the pressure is on this one spot. And if we compare that over here, it's a pad. It doesn't look like it's that big of a difference, but it spreads that pressure out across this little spot here. And what that means is that this is just a little bit easier to take in and out of your pocket, but it still has really great retention, so this doesn't go anywhere. But I find that this style that is just like a thicker landing zone at the bottom or a wider landing zone makes it easier to not have it kind of like drag as you go in and out. One of the other things that I really, really love about what he's done here on both of these even is he's put his maker's mark there in the lock bar relief. I adore that. That is so freaking good. And part of what that means is that this is an otherwise completely sterile knife. And that, I love that. I love that. I hate billboarding on knives. I mean, it's okay if there's a little logo right there, okay if there's a little logo there, it's okay if there's a blade steel marking, but honestly, I would so much rather have this, where there is just almost no indication whatsoever that there's branding on it, and the little bit that is cleverly hidden in this way that's just downright fun. I love it. Plus, it's a cool logo. Going back to that clip for just a moment ago, the one thing that I don't adore about these knives is just that they don't carry deep carry. That's going to be true of any kind of milled tie clip. Some will be wider and they'll be able to put these screws horizontally, which allows you to get a little bit deeper. I prefer things like that. This one having them in line means that you get right about there. So it's certainly not the worst in the world. It's also a very attractive looking butt end and clip part that sticks out. So yeah, but I always would prefer a deep carry clip if I could get one. You'll also see that there is no lanyard hole on this knife. So the lanyard mafia is going to cry some about that, but I personally love that. I'm not a lanyard person. And so this gorgeous surface here, if it had a big cutout, that would just be sad to me. You can also see that the blade to handle ratio here is really, really well handled. This comes up as far as you can possibly go, and it sits down in a way that you can't catch it or nick it or anything like that. Similarly, you can't catch up here either. I think if I really shoved my finger down, no, even there, I'm not touching it. And so this is one of those things where it's just really well encased. You don't have to worry about cutting yourself at all. Also, the fact that this curves in like this means that it's really easy to slide your hand past. This backspacer just kind of guides your hand in. And so when this was in my pocket, man, yeah, this also pointing up slightly more means that the knife is kind of tends to want to pull back into your pocket that way. And that just makes this front part here, instead of being flat in your pocket, it makes it kind of curl in, which makes this all the more just like something that slides right in and super easy. And there's nothing to scratch, nothing to nick. And there's no, as Nick Shabazz would call it, a pocket pecker up here. And so this is kind of a dream to carry. I forget exactly how heavy this is, but it also feels like a really good balance of weight. It feels light enough, and for the size, it feels perfect. But it's the kind of weight where, wow, that's so freaking good. It's the kind of weight where when you have it in your hand and you move it around, it doesn't feel hollow. It just feels really nice. And in pocket, it basically disappears. You can see where this clip point is attaching when I go back to the clip again. Can I get that to show? It's not contacting on the lock bar. I thought at first it might be just because of the way it looks, but it's technically contacting on the scale just a little bit. I'd say about half of it would be over the lock bar. But another nice thing is that that contact point is far up enough from this that there's no snagging opportunity. Sometimes this lock bar relief will be close enough to that contact point that your pants will just kind of catch on it as you're trying to push through. But this slides in and out of pocket super, super well. So, is there anything else I want to talk about this? I don't know, man. This thing, there's T8 hardware everywhere, which makes it super easy to disassemble, except this is probably the one thing that this knife did wrong, and this wasn't Brian Brown's fault. It was actually a surprise to him that this came out this way. He assumed that this was a captive pivot because that's the way he did things on his last one with Reate, and so he just assumed that that was going to be that way. He thought he'd asked for that or something. I don't remember how the miscommunication happened, but even he was surprised to find that this is actually a free spinning pivot, and it's not tooled on the other side. And that's he already knows about that. He put out an issue, a thing talking about how to even handle it if you're trying to disassemble his knife, and that's something he's definitely going to change on the next run. But it does mean that it can be hard to take apart this knife if this particular one happens to have a little bit more Loctite than others. If this is the case, what you can typically do is press on the blade this way. And what that basically, I guess the other way too, but you can like press it against a surface, or you can kind of like cock it with your thumb as you're going. What that basically is doing is putting lateral pressure, pinching down on the pivot from the blade and making it captive that way, by capturing it that way. I was able to back this out, like I said, just a little bit, which means this one, I didn't have any trouble. This didn't spin on me. This wasn't Loctited in. So I didn't have any trouble, but I've heard some people did. But again, it's a problem that is known and already remedied for future runs. So other than that, yeah, I don't really find anything at all that I would change about this knife. Now, I didn't take this knife apart because it's not mine, but Brian did say to treat it as my own, so he said I could. But part of the reasons I didn't take it apart is that if you want to see what's going on inside this, you can actually just see that on his own Instagram. He posted a video when talking about this pivot that shows what's going on inside the knife, and so if you want to see, it's pretty straightforward. Also, there's just not a lot of wild craziness going on. There's fantastic milling like we saw earlier, but there's nothing like really weird or novel happening inside this like internals, how that's all sticking together. What we basically have here is a internal stop pin, the kind that is captive into the blade itself and travels with the blade. You can see it moving there. Yeah. Through a smile-shaped arc that's right there milled into the handle. That's one of my favorite kinds because when it opens like that, the stop pin hits into the handle in two different spots, and that distributes that impact force into the handles really, really well. Partly that's just a good design in terms of spreading out forces, but also you feel that reverberation so well. It just gives you a really satisfying click into your hand and a really satisfying sound. That's also part of the reason why this is so freaking bank vaulty, because this style of stop pin, because it can't wiggle back and forth inside the blade and it's being pressed in two different spots against the handle, that means it's adding an additional anchor point, like an additional lateral side-to-side motion anchor point that keeps it really, really locked up. That's not going to impact up and down blade play the same way, but it's going to impact side-to-side. And it just, yeah. It works and feels fantastic. So my final thoughts about this is that, like, even with that statement I just said, this is still not a knife that I would purchase. I am so freaking glad that I got to get it, but yeah, I don't plan on going out and buying one. And that is just still entirely an aesthetic choice. I still don't like clip point blades that much. It's not that there's anything wrong, and this is actually a really cool looking version of it, but I personally find these types of blade profiles to be something that I like looking at occasionally, but not often enough to actually want to own one. And the other thing is that this is, while slightly shorter than 3.5 inches, this is still a little bit longer than I typically want. And so for those two entirely me problem issues, yeah, I'm not going to buy this knife, but I totally get why people love it. I totally get why, if this is a blade shape that you like and this is a blade size that you like, why this could be one of your absolute favorite knives. And I'm amazed at how well, even with that extra little bit of blade length that I'm used to, I'm amazed at how well this works and fits in my hand. So I'm pretty damn impressed with this knife. And yeah, I think that's about where I'm going to end it. Like, I think that if this looks like something you're going to like, you're going to love it. And if this looks like something you're on the fence about, once you get it in hand, it feels really, really great. I think you're going to love it. Yeah, there's nothing else more to say. This thing is really cool. Okay, thank you so much for watching. And again, huge thank you to Brian Brown for sending this my way. I'll catch you guys all next time.